Hello and welcome to another FrontEnd Engineering Explained live stream video. Depends on how you're watching this. So as you may or may not have seen from the little title card, it says event listeners. And so in this video, I'm going to talk about event listeners. Surprise, surprise. And as mentioned in the description, I am going to be using a couple of Codepen demos to make it more practical. Because if somebody asks you, what are JavaScript event listeners? Well, they're JavaScript functions that are executed because an event that you were listening to for happened. So it's listeners that listens for events. And when the events happen, it calls a function. So, that kind of goes round and round and round. And so I feel like it'll be much easier to understand if you look at some practical examples. Now, there are many events you can listen for in JavaScript, and we will not be covering all of them. But I'll cover the 3 or 4 that you are going to use by the vast majority of the time. You're going to be using these all the time, encountering them from early on. So whether you're just starting or you're a couple of months or so into your JavaScript learning journey, these are things you're going to encounter pretty early on, if not almost from day one. So understanding at least what these are and how they work is going to get you on your way to then look at other things. Some of the events, just to ramble off a few, there's keyboard events, there are click events or mouse events, there are touch events, there are animation end events, there are various other types of animation events, there are custom events that you can send, there are message events, there are tons of events. There are even complete languages that are event-driven, and to some extent, JavaScript can be event-driven depending on how you write your code. Event-driven means that your code runs based on events. So whenever an event happens, it triggers some code to be executed, which will usually, as a side effect, trigger another event, which would then cause another part of your code to execute, or it relies on events triggered by the user to do things. So it waits on events, and therefore it's event-driven. So you can say that some of these demos are event-driven because like this demo, for example, then nothing is happening, right? It's just static. It's something that looks almost kind of like a Scrabble tile or maybe a keyboard key or something like that, but it's just static and it has the letter A in there. And if we look at the HTML over here, I'll zoom in a bit. We'll see that it's just a div with a div inside, and then KBD, which is a semantic way to mark up something that is a keyboard key, for example, the control key, or in this case, the A key. I'm using the KBD here to wrap that. And there's a moth attacking me. This by itself, not so interesting. There's a little bit of CSS. Over here, feel free to click on the links in the description and have a look at these. But let's get to the part that you're here for, the JavaScript part. So this is essentially what it will almost always boil down to. Now, there's 2 variants for a lot of events. So you could do document.addEventListener, and this is how you will almost always do it. Is this the correct way of doing it? I, for one, will say that I'm not sure there is very many correct ways to do something. It's more like what works and what makes sense for you and your brain, and what makes sense in the project with the other people that you're working with. Like if they've decided to use some of the other forms, like for example, instead of doing document.addEventListener, there are these other kind of shortcuts you can say that is like on key down or something like that. And then you say blah, 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 on key down, for example, equals, and then a function. I almost never use those unless somebody previously has already used it like that. And then I will continue with the convention that they've used. For the most part, this is how I would do it. If I just start writing something, I will use the document.addEventListener. Another small point here. I'm attaching the event listener to the document, but it doesn't always have to be attached to the document. We'll see that in a second. The reason I'm doing that here is because I want to listen for key events, so keyboard events, that happens not in a specific, on a specific container or within a specific input, like let's say, for example, a text input, but I just want to know about all the events that happen. Because the interesting thing about events is they bubble. What does that mean? So much like you could imagine when you have a little wand and you have soap on there and you're blowing through it, the bubbles go up, right? They don't just go down immediately, they go up. Now, the same thing, if you think about the DOM is a tree. So you start with the body at the top and then you like go down this like tree structure with all the elements that's make up your entire document. So the DOM, the document object model. So if you trigger an event way down here, then most events bubble up. And so even though they happen here at the bottom and body sits right at the top here, or document, this event will eventually bubble up and reach this document. And then if you have an event listener there, then this event listener will go, it'll grab it and look at this event. And it'll say, in our case over here, like, is this event a key down event? And if it is, it's going to call this function that's the second parameter to the add event listener call. So if it's not, it'll just like let it go and like it'll bubble away, and maybe something else somewhere else will catch it, or it will just eventually reach the top of the document and then just burst, I guess. Same thing here. If it bubbles up, it gets to the document, it grabs the event, it says, what are you? A key up, cool, I was looking for one of these, and then it'll execute the event or the function that is meant for this event. Now, as you can see, one of the things that we get that the browser gives us in our callback function. So our callback function is this function that we're executing when we've caught an event that we're interested in. One of the things it gets is the event itself. And the event itself contains a multitude of things depending on the event. Now, what we're interested in here is that a key down event happens. So this means you press the key down, right? You haven't let it go yet. You've only pressed it down. So one of the things we can get is the key. And if we use this property on the event, it'll tell us like it's an A, lowercase a, uppercase A, it's a control key, it is a shift key, it is, there's also other ways to determine these what's called control keys, like shift and control and all of these, but you can also get them from here. In this example, we are saying if our event.key.length, because that key, so for example, A, is a string, we can ask the browser to tell us what's the length of the string. Now, let's say, for example, you press the shift key. Well, the length is SHIFT, so it's 5. But we are not interested in those, because what we want to do is we want to, in this first thing, we want to toggle a class. So we want to add a class onto our key container. And in our second instance, we want to do two things. We want to remove that class, and we'll see now what the effect of that is. But also, we want to set the text content of our key, which, as we can see here, is this element that has the class key. So this is this KBD, and this is this. No surprise maybe there. We want to set the text content of it. So you can maybe start thinking what might happen when we press a key, when we have focus on this document part and start pressing keyboard keys. So, but we're saying we're only interested if that length is 1. So it's a single character, for example, an A or a B or a C or a D. If it's any more than that, we're just going to ignore it. So the event is still caught. But inside that callback function, we can have some conditional logic to say, cool, this is the event we were looking for, but we're actually a bit more specific even than that. even though it's a key down, we only want to do stuff if that key is of length 1. Nothing more, nothing less. I don't think there's many keys that will have less than 1, but you know what I mean. So, okay, so let's look through this one more time. We're adding an event listener to the document. We're listening for an event with the name key down. When that event reaches our document, it'll call our callback function. In our callback function, we're getting an event property, which we can interrogate for various things. In this case, we're saying if the event has a property called key, and that length of that key, which is a string, is exactly 1, exactly length 1, so 1 character. Then for the key container, which is the outer div, we want to add the class key down, right? And if we have a look at our CSS, we can see here it's going to like undo some stuff and it's going to move it a little bit and stuff like that. We'll see it now in practice. So that is what we want to do. Then we're also doing attaching or listening for another event on the document, key up. So this is when you release the key. Now, when it grabs that, we're doing the same thing. Callback's being called, it gets the event property. If the event is a property called key and the key is of length 1, we're going to take that value. Remember I said key would be like the string A with the uppercase or lowercase, or it'll be the number 8 or whatever that may be. We want to set that as the text content of this element. And then the class we just added when the person pressed the key down, we want to remove that. Okay? So with all of that, what is the effect of that? The effect is when I type, you see this bouncing around and we're seeing it output whatever I'm typing, right? And if I hold in Shift, you'll see even though I have Shift held down now, because we're only interested in keys or key that has a value that's of length 1, nothing is happening. And I let it go, nothing's happening. Because again, our conditional, our if statement, nothing in there is running. But this means that I can now type in caps, right? I can use the, so number keys, but I'm seeing the other thingies. And yeah, so this is a nice way that you can, this is one demonstration of how you can listen for different kind of keyboard events and then react on it. And also that you don't always have to listen just for the event itself, but inside there, you can kind of interrogate a little bit more, right? If you want to be more specific, and you can narrow down the broader event to a much narrower use case, in which case you only want to do something in that case. Cool. Let's move on to the next one. So this next one combines a couple of things. And we'll start by looking at the HTML. And so basically what we have here is we have a little select element here. We have a button, and then we have just some space, and we'll see what happens there now. Then here, as the label says, type some text and see a live preview of the selected font family. And this is just a text area where you can just type in. So our HTML is pretty straightforward. You zoom in a little bit more. We have a container class, and then we have a preview section. And within our preview section, we have a label, which is select a font to preview. We have our select dropdown, which is some values. And then we have our button, which is of type button, because this is not part of a form. We're not submitting anything. So it's just a button. It's not going to try and submit anything. It has its value. Then we have a pre-element. A pre-element means there's pre-formatted text in here. And we'll see why that's really useful when we start typing in that text input. And then we have our input part, which is just our label. And we're associating it there with the ID and the for attribute. This is for accessibility, so that this input actually has an accessible name, and the accessible name tells the user what to do, which is type some text to see a live preview of the selected font family. And so we have our text area, and that is all the HTML that we need. Then we have a little bit of CSS here. The most interesting part for us is here, where I'm importing some fonts from Google Fonts. So you might see a correlation here between some of these names and the fonts. So you'll see Lato, I don't know how you pronounce that, Meriwether and Montserrat. So we're importing those. And of course, when the user selects these, we will then add one of these classes. And based on that, it'll set the font family for the element on which we are setting this class to use that font, right? So we are going to be adding it onto our output. So onto this. Cool. So with that, that's all the CSS. The other things you can have a look at. It's not that important for this. But then if we go further down, here's our JavaScript. Surprisingly, not a lot for what we're going to see in the end. So we're doing a couple of things here. We have our font family selector. That is our select dropdown over here. We have our input container, right? This is our text area down here. We have our preview font button. So this is our update font family over here, and our output container, which is our pre that lives in this white space over here. So we're just using query selector to get a couple of elements of the page. And I don't want to well, actually, no, I'm not going to mention that. I'll mention that at some other point. There's like some shortcuts you can do here, which is really interesting, but I'll leave that for a different video. Now, here's what I said before. Here I'm adding an event listener, also an event listener that's listening for keyboard events, but I'm attaching it only to the input container, so only to this text area. So if keyboard events happen anywhere outside of this event listener will not be interested in it. It's like, don't care, and it just moves right along. Then here is one of the other events that you'll use a lot, which is click event. And by the way, if you tap on something on a mobile device, it'll also, under the hood, trigger a click event. So you don't have to bind or listen for both a click and a touch event, touch down, touch up, stuff like that. Just doing like this, preview font button, which is our button over here, .add event listener click will work on your desktop devices when you're clicking with the mouse. It'll work if somebody uses a keyboard and presses the space bar or the enter key, and it'll also work on mobile. So yet another reason why you want to use a button element and not a div, and because then you need to attach all these different or listen for all these different events, because you're getting none of that for free, right? So cool. Then what we want to do, so first things first. So we're attaching two event listeners. The one attached to the text area, listening for the key up event, so when you let a key go. And then we're attaching listening for another event, this time specifically on this button. So if I click here, or I click over here, or I click down there, or I click in here, this will not be triggered. This one will only be triggered when I click on that button, okay? So when a key up happens here, all we're doing is we're taking whatever text is in the text area and we're setting it into our output container, which is our pre-element here, right? So you can imagine what happens. I am typing some text. And of course, if I type really badly, it shows that I'm typing some text. And you can see now that it's using like a monospace font, and that's because that's the default of a pre-element, right? It's often used to wrap like a code block, and then code is normally displayed also in a monospace font. So the default for that is, but we can change it, and we'll change it soon. The other cool thing with the pre is, now if I press enter, say twice, and some more, you will see it respects the spaces, the enter keys, and all of that. It respects all of that. If you didn't put it in a pre, and you, for example, put it in a div, it'll just be one long line of text unless you do some JavaScript mangling to make it look that way. But here we're like getting it for free, right? So you can type some stuff. Very cool. So that is what this is doing. It's listening for those key up events, and as they happen, it just updates that preview with whatever is in the text area. Now, when we click this button, we are going to get the value of the select element. So the value is going to be one of these, right? So it's either going to be an empty string, or it's going to be this, this, or this, right? And if you look closely here, you will notice that the class names matches the value exactly, right? And this is important because this means when we do this part over here, output container.classlist.add, we can just set that value as the class because it matches exactly. Lowercase, exactly the same thing. So this is really nice. You don't have to do any kind of string concatenation, that kind of stuff. Not a big deal, but I mean, it's one less thing you have to do, right? And we're going to say if selected font family, because if you've selected this one, nothing should happen, right? So I click the button, I type, it's still a monospace font because it's an empty string, and an empty string is what is known as falsy. So we're saying if selected font family, so you could also say if selected font family is true, then do the thing inside. So if it's an empty string, it's false, and therefore we will not do any of this. So we're not going to apply that font family. All right, so what does it do when it's not an empty string? Then if we type, this is some text, and this is some more text, and now we choose a different font, let's say Merriweather, and we update, our text changes, right? Montserrat, our text changes. Again, if we choose nothing, nothing will change. We could make it so that if it's an empty string, we remove any classes that's on that and kind of reset it back to the monospace font. This is something you can maybe experiment with when you play around with this demo. So now we've learned a couple more things. We're now attaching an event listener to a specific element and listening for a specific keyboard event, and then taking the value of the one and sticking it into the value of another one. We've also looked at attaching a click event to a button. We've talked about all the many benefits you get by using an actual button element and not a div or some other random HTML element, but using a button, which is what a button does. Button do things or make things happen. And we've seen how, again, we can use our conditionals to limit when we actually change anything on our page. Okay, and for the last one, we're going to move over to a little search. And the reason I'm doing the search is to show you one of the other ones that you will encounter a lot, which is the submit event. So the submit event happens when we submit a form, for example. In this case, we're going to submit a form that will then cause a search to be done on Unsplash, and it'll return us some images, and we will then render the images to the web page. So let's have a quick look at the HTML. We have a form. We give an ID. This makes it easy for us to refer to it when we're doing our query selector. Give it a name. And we're saying that the method will be post because we're posting information to the server, and then the server will return us some information. We wrap everything in a field set. So all these, like our input and our little select dropdown here, we wrap that in a field set, and we give it a legend. So the legend tells the user what these grouped controls do, or what you will use them for. And you will use them to find the perfect image, powered by Unsplash. Then again, we have an input type hidden here. So this is something the user doesn't see, but you need it for some reason. Two things. When you're working with sensitive information, don't do this, because anybody can still do view source and see whatever's there. Just because it's not shown in the UI, it's still in the source code in the developer tools or just in the right click and view source. It's still there. So you don't want to expose sensitive information in this way. Secondly, should you play around with this, you will need an API key. You can get one for free from Unsplash. You will need one of those in order to use for this to actually work. As I say here, please do not leave your access key here, as it will be exposed, because anybody else that comes to your Codepen will be able to see your access key if you leave it in here. So paste it in there, Don't save your Codepen. Play around with it, and before you leave, replace it with just your access key again. Okay, remove your actual access key and stick this one in. In some future video, I will talk about how we get around this in the front-end world by using environment variables, sticking things in that comes from the server and stuff like that. And oftentimes you will not do this actual API call on the client, but you'll call the server and the server will do the call to the API, because then you can keep your keys secure on the server. But here, I didn't want to complicate it with all of this, so I'm cheating a little bit here. So that is what this is for. But again, please remember the things I mentioned here in terms of security, and also when you play with this, be careful. Then this is just a grouping div. Then we have our label. Again, we're associating our label with our input element, so for and ID. So now a user knows that this is our keywords. That's what they're meant to type in there. And then down here, we have a label saying orientation, and then they have a choice of either landscape or portrait. So that's the orientation of the photo. And then we have our button. This time, it's called type equals submit. So when you do that, when you click that button, the browser will automatically submit the form. So you don't have to do anything. We're going to be doing something, but you don't have to do anything on your side. It'll just try to submit. But we want to do some stuff with JavaScript, so we're going to intercept that submit and do some stuff, right? There's the key. We're going to intercept that submit. And to do that, we have to listen for the event. So there's some CSS in here. You can look over it. There's nothing really super interesting. This is basically just some Flexbox stuff so that the layout is nice. We'll see that in a second. Cool. So let's look at the JavaScript. There's quite a bit more here, and it's mostly because we are building our UI that outputs our images through JavaScript. And we're not using any external library or anything like that. So let's look at the first things first. So here's our form, right? Then we're going to skip over render for the moment. And again, we're attaching an event listener to our form, not the document, to our form, because we are saying when this form triggers a submit event, this specific form. So if you have multiple forms on a page, you can attach different submit handlers to each form. There's another thing called event delegation, separate video. Now, the very first thing we do in here is we say event.prevent default. Remember what I said before? Events bubble. Now, also, events cause other things to happen. One of the things that happens when a submit event is triggered and it gets all the way up is the browser will submit it. If there's an action attribute on your form, it'll submit it to whatever the endpoint is, the URL, that's the value of the action attribute. Now, ours doesn't have an action attribute, but let's say, for example, it had action equals /, which would be the page you're currently on. Without the event.prevent default, it would submit the form to the same page. So the page will reload. And if you're doing a GET request, you will see stuff like what's up here in this URL bar. A question mark, and then some parameters at the back, some keys and values. If you have more than one, they'll get ampersand next to it, and the next one, and and so on and so forth. For ours, you won't see that because we're using post. So when you use post, again, don't worry too much about understanding this. This is just some additional information I'm providing you, something for me to discuss in a future video. But when you use post, it uses the body of the request and it sends the information inside the body. There's ways you can see that as a developer and anybody using a browser, really. But we won't look at that today. But we're saying, stop. We're going to take over here because we want to do some stuff. We don't actually want you to do the submitting. We'll do the submitting. And truth be told, we're not going to submit anything. So what do? We have our event, we prevent the default. So nothing's going to happen. The browser's going to go, burp, stop. Cool. Then we're going to get our results container. So if we go down, This is interesting because, no. I know what this is. Okay, so here I'm getting a results container. You won't see it in the HTML. We create that with JavaScript. What I'm doing here is I'm trying to get it. And then again, I'm doing this if thingy. So I'm saying if there is a result container, remove it, because we're going to generate a new one and inject it. Now, here's the stuff that you might be more interested in for the moment. We're using a JavaScript API called the Form Data API. So this makes things that in the past was quite finicky, really, really simple. And there's another powerful one you'll see just in a second. So we're passing our form, so what we got from the DOM up here. We're not doing anything to it. We're just getting it, and we're passing it straight into form data. And this is going to give us a form data object. And we can do all kinds of things with that. But what we're going to do in this case is we're going to pass it to this other function called URL search params. And that is what these things are called, by the way. This editors equals 0010. That is a URL search param. And again, like I said, you can have multiple search params. So what this is going to do is it's going to unpack the form. There's some caveats here if you include file uploads. Let's leave that to the side for the moment. But in our case, we only have a hidden and a select and an input field. So for all of those, it's totally cool. It's going to unpack our form data object. It's going to take those elements out of it, and it's going to construct an object that is equal to what our URL search params should be. And then it takes that and it converts it into a string. All the magic that the web platform is just giving us. So we're taking our form data or our form element, we're passing it into form data. This is giving us a form data object. We're taking that form data object, giving it to URL search params, unpacks it, creates an object representing the URL search params, and then we're saying it, call the toString method on it, which then converts it into a string. Then we have an endpoint. So this is the endpoint for searching for photos on using the Unsplash API. And here you can see is our question mark. So this tells the browser everything after this is our URL search parameters. So this is the path, and everything on this side is the URL search parameters. And we're just using, so these are called JavaScript template literals, or just template literals. And basically, this is a simpler, more powerful way to concatenate strings, which is take two or more strings and turn them into a single string. So I can quickly show you here. So in the past, this is like an example where you might think like, what's the benefit? There's down in the stack benefits as well, but in the past you would do something like this. So you would do that, and then you would do plus, and then search, params like this. So instead of what we have here, you would have that. Again, like I said, in this instance, not much to it, right? But there is a lot of powerful things you can do with this, which I won't go into now, but definitely a topic for another video. But this constructs the endpoint we want to call to get our results back. Then we're using, again, a web platform feature called fetch, and we're just giving it the endpoint because we're just sending it some data. We don't really have to pass any additional options or any specific headers or anything like that. We're just calling the endpoint. And then when it comes back, we're going to store that in a variable or a const called response. One of the properties available on it is OK, which tells us that we did the fetch, we got a response, everything looks good. So if everything was good, then we have this function. There's also one called .text. But because we know, because if you look at the Unsplash API documentation, we know that the response will contain JSON. We can say response.json. And this will take whatever was sent back during the fetch, and it will basically call JSON.parse on that string of JSON, turning it into an object that we can then use in JavaScript. So I'm going to jump back to a couple of things in a second, but let's just move one more line on. And then we say document.body, so the body element of the document, append, and now we're calling render, the function that we'll quickly walk through, and we're saying, and we're passing it data.results. Again, if you refer to the Unsplash documentation, you will see that that is a property in the JSON object that contains all of our image results. Now, a couple of things that I kind of just flew over, and again, I'm just mentioning this because you might look at it and wonder what the heck is this. Don't worry too much about it. There will be future videos, articles, and stuff that will dig into this. But you will notice up here something a little different to the other ones, and that's this keyword called async. And this basically means that inside this function, there's some asynchronous functionality, some asynchronous calls that's going to happen. And by doing this, you're also now able to do this. Again, I can go into more detail, but I'm not going to, because there's promises and there's how things used to be with promises, which you can still use and is still sometimes useful. But one of the things that you can maybe search for is what was known as callback hell. And await, async await kind of, it's one of the big pain points that it solves, is it gets us out of this callback hell. This used to be something that was especially prevalent in the Node.js world because of the way that you used to write code there. But basically what this is saying is this is going to do some asynchronous work. So we don't know when it's going to be done. So before you execute anything further, wait for this, whatever this thing's doing, to finish and come back with a result. And this has to come back with either a resolve or a reject. If everything was good, kind of like our response.ok, then we have our response will be a, what did I just say? I left my mind now. Well, confirm, let's just say confirm, not the right word. If it failed, we'd say reject. If it rejects, it'll just jump out, and this is why we have this in a try and catch block, because this allows us to say, we're going to try some stuff, and if anything goes wrong, we're going to catch that over here, and we're going to handle it. Right now, we're doing the least amount of effort, which is just logging the error to the console. Normally, in actual your day job, you would try to handle this in a more graceful way. You might have some kind of fallback, or if nothing else, you would possibly send this error off to something like Sentry, which would then collect all your errors. And if some error happens a lot, it'll alert you, either in Mattermost or Slack or Microsoft Teams or somewhere, email. It'll send you a notification saying, hey, this error is happening a lot. For example, it's happened 100 times in the last 5 minutes or something like that. And then you know, uh-oh, something's wrong. And you can go react to it. And there's a lot more that these services do to make finding the bug that is triggering this error much, much easier. For now, we're just saying like, there was an error, just throw it to the console so we can have a look at what went wrong. But let's say fetch was successful, then it'll come back and it'll say, good, and we move on. Same thing here. So response.json, this is going to do something that'll take a bit of time, but we do rely on the result of this in the very next line. So we don't want to move on to the next line before this one is not finished. Therefore, we need to await. Wait for it to finish, store the result in data, then move on to the next line. Okay. So then it just calls render, and I'm not going to go into too much here, but basically what render does is it creates an unordered list element, it adds the results class on it, and then it uses this array function called map, and basically the result of a map on an array is you create a new array from your existing array. So from the entries array, we're creating a new array called list items, And basically, while entries is just an array of results, what list items would be is an array of list elements. So as you can see here, we create a normal link element, a list item element, and an image element. We deconstruct some stuff out of the entry. We add a class. We set the href, a target, a rel attributes on the link. We add some stuff to our image, a class, alt, based on the description that came back from Unsplash. We, out of the URLs array, we grab the regular one, set that as the source of the image. We use the height provided by Unsplash, the width provided by Unsplash, and we set that as the values for the height and width attributes. Then we append the image to our link because we want our image to be a link to the actual image on Unsplash. And then we take our link and we stick it into our list item, so our li, and then we return our li. And then it'll do this for each and every one. So in the end, our list items will be this array of list item elements. So 1 or 20. At the moment, it'll be no more than 10 because that's the default number that Unsplash returns. Then we take our list container, so that's our UL, and we append all of the list items. The 3 dots over here basically says spread. So it says like take the array and then unwrap it and spread all the elements as a comma-separated list inside this function. And that is exactly what append expects, is 1 or more elements that are comma-separated if there's more than 1. So this creates our UL with all our list items, and then we just return our entire UL, which is our results container from earlier, right? And then we're just sticking that into the document body. This is a lot. What I want you to take away from this is that we have a form. On that form, we're adding an event listener that listens for the submit event. When you click the search button, because it has type equals submit, it's going to trigger a submit event on this form. We will catch that event, intercept it. We will call prevent default on the event, which will tell the browser, don't you worry, we got this. We're going to do some work. And in the end of the day, we are going to append some stuff to the document. So we're not actually submitting data to our own server. We're actually just getting data from the form that we then use to make a call to a third-party API to get some data that we want to display to the user. And this is a very common practice that you will do in your day-to-day job. Again, as mentioned, sometimes you will, but oftentimes this endpoint will be an endpoint on your own server. And this server will call this because of this whole token, the secret access token that you need to keep secret. That is why you won't do this in the front end, because then you're going to expose your token and you're going to be in a world of hurt if somebody finds that and starts using your token to do nasty things or just spin up a massive bull. So, which is a nasty thing in itself. Cool. So let's see this work. And to show you, I need to move my browser off of the screen I'm sharing so you can't see my X key. So let me confirm. Now it looks like you can still see it. Did I share? I really hope it just looks like you can. Okay. And I'm going to close it up. If you could see that, please don't pause the video and look what my key is. Okay, so with that in place, I'm not going to save, but I'm going to hit run because now my latest HTML with this value in there is going to be there. And so now let's open our network panel over here. Let's type in cat. Let's do landscape and let's hit search. So there's our little kitties, and as you can see, it's using Flexbox, so it's it's nicely laid out. But the other interesting thing is here you can see is that that request that went in and then the response that came back. And you can see here's our results array with our array of results that we mapped through and created this UI here. So if we look at this here, again, we can see it's our unordered list with our list items. Each one has a link that points to the actual one with all those attributes you saw, and then our image with all of its stuff on there. So yeah, pretty nice way to create something useful with very little code, to be honest. And that is where I will end it for this video. If we click here, we can see that it does trigger a link, and it does actually go to this really cute photo on Unsplash. And we'll give it a heart. And I hope you found this useful. As mentioned in the description, should you have any questions, comments, feedback, please let me know. The links to all these code pens are also in the description. Again, be careful with your access keys. Don't leak them. And if you think you did, remove it from wherever it is so it no longer exists, so it no longer can work. And with that, have fun building cool stuff for the web. Remember to keep accessibility top of mind. We need to ensure that the web is usable by everybody. So keep that in mind. Use the appropriate HTML elements and have fun. And I will see you in the next video soon. By the way, if you have any topics you'd like me to discuss, let me know those in the description as well. And if you like what I'm doing, like and subscribe, as they say. And I'll speak to you soon. Bye. Peace.